Protea is definitely my favorite frame out of the 3 that came out in 2020. I like Zaku and I have mixed feelings about Lavos, but I adored Protea from the start and I knew I would give her an Umbra Forma. Since Nightwave Intermission 3 has just started and we will get 2 Umbra Forma from the rewards, and I can get a blueprint from Teshin's Steel Path Honors every 8 weeks, I decided it was time to finally finish my Protea builds. So in this video I will cover, first, the easiest way to farm Protea. Second, how her abilities work. Then I will show you my builds using 1 Umbral polarity. Then which Helminth abilities to consider and my recommendations for her equipment. And lastly, how Protea behaves in various missions and what to keep in mind while playing her. Protea is one of the more annoying frames to farm, but it's not as bad as others have made it out to be. Her main blueprint is awarded for completing the Deadlock Protocol quest. During the quest you will get the parts and blueprint for the Zorus, which is needed to farm Protea. It took me around 45 minutes to complete the quest for this recording. There is this tricky part that confused me the first time I played the quest where you need to hit Protea with the explosion from the Zorus. You will need to hit her twice with a fully charged Zorus explosion. Protea's component blueprints can be acquired from the Granum Void. To enter it you will need to find the Golden Hand Tribute in the Corpus Ship tileset and use a Granum Crown. The treasurers that carry the crowns appear in the same tileset within 2 to 5 minutes of non-endless missions and 5 to 8 minutes of endless missions. Depending on the level of the mission, the treasurer will carry a different type of crown. Granum crowns at levels from 0 to 15, Exemplar Granum crowns at levels from 16 to 30, and Zenith Granum crowns at levels higher than 30. You will need all 3 types to farm Protea. Each type of Granum crown opens a different difficulty of the Granum Void with different levels of enemies, regardless of the mission the crown was used in. Granum crowns open the Granum Void that has the chance to give you the Neuroptics blueprint. Exemplar Granum crown will open the extended Granum Void which has the chance to give you the chassis blueprint. And the Zenith Granum crown opens the Nightmare Granum Void, which can give you the system's blueprint. My recommendation is to use the capture missions corresponding to the level of the crown you're using, so that you don't run out of them. Once inside the Granum Void, you will need to kill at least 75 errant specters within 60 seconds. The number increases by 25 for each squad member. You can add time to the clock by freeing the captured Fortuna workers with the Zorus or by collecting the little yellow pyramids. Regardless of what other advice you might have heard, my recommendation is to always come prepared and to do this alone. You will need Mesa and take the Zorus with you just in case. My Mesa is fairly tanky, but even if yours isn't, you might only get in trouble in the Nightmare Granum Void, but you can use health restores if necessary. Before you enter the Granum Void make sure you're full of energy. If you're alone, the number of specters you need to kill will be lower. They will also spawn around you, not spread out over the map. What you can do is just stand where you spawned and use Peacemaker to kill the specters. If you're doing this with squad mates, the specters will spawn all over the map. You should group up in the middle and not spread out. You will also need to have someone adding time to the clock by freeing the workers or collecting pyramids. Ironically, Protea is also good at farming Protea, but you will only be able to use Protea if you already have a Protea and need another Protea to feed to the Helminth. Don't use Zaku, their guns disappear once they enter the Granum Void and they can't spawn more from the specters. It took me around 2 hours to get all parts for Protea. Let's go over Protea's abilities. Her passive grants her plus 100% ability strength on every 4th ability cast. The stored charges are displayed in the UI element in the lower right corner. The charges are not lost if you enter a nullifier bubble. Protea's first ability is the Grenade Fan. If you tap it she will throw out 3 grenades that create a swirly slashy vortex with a base radius of 5 meters and 33% status chance. If you hold the ability button she will throw out 4 shield satellites that attach to herself, allies, companions and defense objectives. The shield satellites increase the target's shields instantly and recharge them for the duration, up to the overshield's limit. Once the duration expires, the shield satellite disappears, but the overshields remain. If the target's shield gate is triggered while the satellite is still active, the satellite is destroyed to extend the period of invulnerability by 2 seconds. This is Protea's most reliable defensive ability. Protea's second ability is the Blaze Artillery. Protea deploys her plasma turret in the air facing the aiming reticle. The turret auto-targets enemies within their line of sight, firing at the rate of 3 shots per second. The shots deal heat damage with 100% critical chance with a 1x critical multiplier and 100% status chance. The heat status effect sets enemies on fire, dealing damage over time and strips their armor up to 50%. The critical chance is important even if the multiplier is only 1, because some enemies have damage reduction from non-critical hits. The damage from the turrets increases by 100% for every enemy hit. You will want to increase the duration of this ability and deploy the turrets in front of large groups of enemies. It's important to mention that only 3 turrets can be active at any time. Once you deploy the 4th turret, the first one disappears even if its duration hasn't ended. So you will need to deploy these strategically. Protea's third ability is Dispensary. Protea deploys a device that generates one of 3 pickups every 3 seconds, enhanced health orbs that restore 100 health, and universal ammo pack that restores 10% ammo of the currently equipped weapon, or an energy orb. After one of these is picked up, the dispensary will replenish it after 5 seconds. The dispensary has base 25% cons to generate an extra pickup. This chance is affected by ability strength. This is also Protea's subsumed ability that you unlock once you feed Protea to the Helminth. Its duration is severely reduced once it's subsumed to other frames, from 25 to 12 seconds. So I'd only recommend using it on frames that already build for duration and strength. It's a very versatile ability, since it generates energy and lets you use your archgun without worrying about the cooldown. Protea's fourth ability is the Temporal Anchor. Protea deploys a temporal anchor that records her position and state, including energy, health, ammo, shields and combo counter. The activation energy is spent and not restored once the anchor breaks. Protea is invulnerable and immune to status effects for 3 seconds while deploying the anchor. A portion of the damage that Protea deals while the anchor is active is stored and unleashed when the anchor expires or upon deactivation. If Protea dies while the anchor is active, she is rewound to her initial state. The anchor can also be deactivated manually by tapping the ability button, while cancelling the return of health, energy and position, but it will trigger the temporal implosion. The implosion will trigger if you deal at least 1 point of damage while the anchor is active. It deals blast damage and pulls the enemies together. Once the anchor is destroyed, Protea will be rewound to her initial position, going through all her afterimages. During this she is invulnerable and immune to status effects, and she can use her other abilities, but aiming them is difficult. Temporal Anchor is Protea's weakest ability and the only one that I have issues with. The first issue I have is that the anchor returns Protea to her starting position, which is inconvenient in missions where you need to keep moving forward. The second is that the energy and health picked up while the anchor is active aren't added to the initial values, so you can end up with less energy after the rewind. So Temporal Anchor should only be activated if your health and energy are full. And my third issue is that, since you should build Protea for duration, it also extends the duration of the Temporal Anchor, which in turn extends the time of the rewind animation, which can be annoying. All 3 of these issues can be resolved by cancelling the ability by tapping the ability button. But the next issue can't be resolved that easily because, I believe, it's a bug. Protea is invulnerable and immune to status effects during the casting animation and the rewind, but if you suffer from status effects and sometimes from any damage while the anchor is active, you won't be returned to full health, even if you cast it at full health. I don't think this is how it was intended to work, but as far as I know, it sometimes does work as intended. So, I can see how this ability was intended to work as a way of restoring health and energy and improving Protea's survivability, as well as a way of pulling enemies together. And the ability to cancel it allows me to think differently about it. But because of the health bug, you can't always count on the health restore. And if you want to use it to group up enemies, it costs a lot of energy compared to abilities that you can subsume onto her. Before we go on to the builds, let's cover which stats are important for Protea. Ability duration will be most important because it saves her energy by not having to cast her grenades and dispensary as often, and it increases the damage from her blaze artillery since it increases with each hit. Ability efficiency is also important since Protea casts her grenades and turrets fairly often. I prefer leaving the efficiency low and using other ways of restoring energy. Ability range is fairly important. You can have it lower than 100%, but don't go under 70% since it will make your grenades useless. With more range, your swirly grenades will cover more area, the turrets will hit enemies at a greater distance, and the temporal implosion will pull in more enemies. Ability strength is also fairly important. It will increase the base damage of the grenade fan and the speed at which the shields are restored with the shield satellites. It also increases the base damage of blaze artillery. Since each shot adds the base damage to the damage dealt, more base damage will make the damage increase faster. Strength will also increase the chance that the dispensary will drop an extra pickup. This is important for your energy economy. And it will also increase the damage conversion from the stored damage to the damage dealt by the temporal implosion once temporal anchor expires. Since the damage type is blast, it's nor really relevant. So Protea builds need to focus on duration, and then strength and range. Protea is so far the only frame with innate universal aura polarity, but I still mostly use energy siphon. She has one innate V or Materai and one dash or Naramon polarity. For my builds I added one Umbral polarity, one dash or Naramon, one D or Vizarin, one V or Materai and double dash or Zeneric polarity. My first build is a standard build that you can use on any mission where you don't need to worry about getting killed, so normal Star Chart and Void Fisher missions, or if you know you will have a good support frame in the squad that will keep you alive. In my opinion, using builds that don't use a survivability mod in high-level missions is either very brave or very stupid. I usually use Adaptation and/or Umbral Vitality to help with survivability, but just for Protea I picked up Rolling Guard. Since it gives invulnerability and clears the status effects, it can actually help with the temporal anchor bug. Mostly, I've been using it because Protea has a special dodge animation. You will see that I use Preparation in every build. It allows Protea to cast her dispensary early or to use her other abilities as soon as the mission starts. My second build focuses on both strength and duration. It also has Umbral Vitality because I don't like dying from walking into toxic clouds. And my third build has less strength and more range, and also Umbral Vitality. I use builds 2 and 3 at higher levels since they can take a bit more damage. Now that we've covered various builds for Protea, let's look at the Helminth abilities and equipment I'd recommend to use. In most normal missions Protea will be able to rely solely on her abilities, but this is something you should consider if you're going to be using Protea in the Steel Path, long arbitrations or some harder sortie missions. If you're going to give Protea a Helminth ability, you should replace Temporal Anchor, since it's her weakest ability. Then you should consider Protea's weaknesses, survivability and crowd control, as well as her biggest strength, which is damage. If you want to increase Protea's damage output, you can use Roar, which increases all damage, both from weapons and abilities. Since the damage increase is reduced when Rhino's Roar is subsumed onto another frame, I recommend using it with a high strength build on Protea, and you can also cast it with the 100% strength increase from Protea's passive ability. You could also use Empower, which increases ability strength by 50%. You can also stack it with the bonus from Protea's passive, for 150% more ability strength. This can either increase damage from Blaze Artillery or Grenade Fan, or increase the chance for an extra drop from Dispensary. Personally, I think that adding more damage on Protea is overkill, since she doesn't really need it most of the time. Instead, you could consider using a more reliable way of increasing Protea's survivability. Since she can heal herself from her dispensary, Protea needs a way of reducing incoming damage. I think that Null Star is a good ability for Protea since it also scales with duration. You should also consider abilities that group up enemies, allowing Blaze Artillery to hit multiple with each hit and adding some crowd control to Protea's kit. Abilities that you could use are Airburst, Larva and Ensnare. Airburst and Larva have a shorter range, but are also easier to get than an extra Cora to feed to the Helminth. Personally, my favorite is Ensnare, but Larva works well too. Airburst leaves the enemies a bit too scattered. You should use a range build if you're going to use any of these three abilities. Keep in mind that these abilities don't work well in open world missions because of the limited range. You could also use other ways of grouping up enemies. You can use a Zaw with the Exodia Hunt Arcane that pulls enemies on a ground slam. Magus Anomaly does something similar on Transference In. And Xenoric Void Singularity also pulls in enemies, though a bit slow. The issue with all of these is that Protea ends up in the middle of the group of enemies, and she should keep her distance. My favorite way of grouping up enemies is the Proboscis Cernos. It doesn't have as much range and doesn't pull enemies as close together as Ensnare, but you also don't need to aim at a target and it applies status effects and deals damage. As her melee weapon, Protea should use something that can kill enemies at a distance. She can be very squishy and should avoid coming into melee range with enemies. So consider using a gunblade like the Retimir Prime or the Stropha, a glaive like Glaive Prime or the Zorus, a Zaw with Exodia Contagion, Warfans with a heavy attack build using the Slicing Feather stance. You could also use the Wolf Sledge or the Zenistar. And if you're going to be using the Proboscis Cernos or Ensnare, you might as well use the Vitrica. Which arcane you choose for Protea can also be important. Since she doesn't need to rely on her weapons for damage, arcanes that increase weapon damage or attack speed are optional. Instead you can use Arcane Guardian, which will help with her survivability since Protea has low armor, or Arcane Grace, that can heal her. You could also use Arcane Eruption, since you will pick up energy orbs fairly often and it helps with her survivability and adds a bit of crowd control. It's important for Protea that she doesn't run out of energy. That's why I use Arcane Energize on her. It's also a way of providing energy to your squad. If you don't have Arcane Energize, you can use a build that uses Equilibrium, because the empowered health orbs will give you 110 energy. Don't forget to use Synth Fiber on your companion so you can pick up health even if your health is full. I also use my Death Cube with Energy Generator. I think it's important to understand how Protea behaves in missions, because I rarely see her played to her full potential. I think people might be under the impression that Protea is a support frame, when she really isn't. Protea really only cares about supporting herself, and if her squad mates benefit from that, it doesn't matter since they probably won't have much to do. Her shield drones can keep her squad mates alive and dispensary can keep them full of energy and ammo. Protea is mostly a damage frame, at least that's how I play her. As long as she keeps using her grenades and turrets, Protea can do tons of damage. Protea's survivability is decent, as long as you can rely on the shield drones and health from dispensary. Protea doesn't have much crowd control, she needs to rely on the slash and heat procs from her grenades and turrets. She can be very fast at killing, a bit slower in higher levels, but she is still effective in the steel path. Protea isn't too hard to play, but you will need to pay attention to her energy and shields. Just remember, if you get in trouble, hold 1. Support yourself, find a place to drop dispensary with the 100% strength bonus. Strategically spam your 1 and 2 for damage. And it's better to replace temporal anchor with some other, more reliable ability. Protea is fairly good at exterminate, sabotage or capture missions, where you just run through the level and kill enemies with blaze artillery. I use preparation and arcane energize to keep her supplied with energy. But Protea is better in missions where she can set up her base with dispensary and grenades, like defense, excavation, mobile defense and survival missions. While she can use her shield drones on the defense target, she can't directly protect it from gunfire. So it's best to team up with a frame that can either protect or heal the defense target better than Protea. I wouldn't recommend using Protea in the index, since she isn't very tanky and requires a lot of energy for her abilities. There is also a bug that can cause energy orbs to stop spawning for all squad members if dispensary is active in the index map, so she isn't good as support there either. Protea is one of the rare frames that I would recommend for open world missions, especially for the Cambion Drift bounties. With a range build, she can cover a big area with her grenades and kill enemies with blaze artillery. I wouldn't recommend using Ensnare or Larva in open world missions because the enemies tend to be too spread out, so it doesn't work as well as it does in normal missions. With a good build and equipment, Protea can be used for the steel path and arbitrations. It's important to pay attention to your shields and energy and to keep moving since she can die easily. Depending on the type of mission you're doing, Protea might need a good support frame to help her. I tend to use a Trinity Spectre, but Wisp can also be good with her health motes. I don't recommend using Protea against Sentience. In conclusion, Protea is one of my favorite frames, mostly because I like to spam abilities and don't like to aim too much. I might sometimes annoy my squad mates by covering the whole map with grenades. While I'm disappointed with Temporal Anchor, I can see how it was intended to work. I hope the bug gets fixed, because I think that it actually can work well as a way of keeping Protea alive in the steel path. If you're looking for a frame that has high survivability, Protea might not be for you. But she isn't bad as a support frame, and she's definitely a good damage frame.